In this video, let's talk about where the structure of intellect came from. Back to World War II, which was happening in the late 1930s and the early to mid 1940s. During this time, the US Army Air Corps needed more pilots. They advertised to men wanting them to join, and then after new potential recruits came, they put them through an application process. And basically, they tried to find out if the men who wanted to join would be good pilots or not. And originally, the US Army Air Corps had their entire application process. And it had different types of tests and things like that to find out how qualified the men would be as pilots. But the thing was that it takes a long time to go from an application process to actually flying a plane. And during the training process, there was a 35% dropout rate, which means that out of 100 men, 35 of them never got into the sky and never flew a plane. You can imagine that the government probably wasn't very happy about this. They felt like they were wasting money and time. And so they wanted to fix this problem so that they could reduce the dropout rate and have more men as pilots. So they started wondering what they could do about it, and they looked at their application process. The health screening from the doctors didn't have a problem with it, and the other thing about physical endurance abilities was also good, and the stress testing that they did seemed to be fine. They were concerned that the intelligence application, that part, was the problem. And so basically, if they wanted to save money, improve their quality, and reduce the 35% dropout rate, then they needed better tests to accept the right pilots. So they decided to change the intelligence test, and they needed somebody to do that. Who could create a better test? Well, someone knew someone who knew something who recommended J.P. Guilford. And this guy right here was brought into the US Army Air Corps to redesign the intelligence testing for the application to become a pilot. Now, I'll save you from a lot of the details, but basically, J.P. Guilford did a whole bunch of experiments and research and spent a lot of time understanding the existing test. He looked at the pilots and things like that, and after a lot of time, he created a new test that could be used with the potential pilots. And the interesting thing was that when they brought it in, things started to change. Now remember, the old dropout rate was 35%. When they introduced Guilford's new test, the dropout rate became less than 10%. This is a pretty significant change. People were very excited about this because it meant that they were saving money. They weren't losing people to stress or difficulty or things like that, and they could ultimately have more higher quality pilots. The government was really excited about that, and after the war finished, the US Department of Defense decided that they wanted to put part of their budget towards J.P. Guilford's ongoing research and his ongoing work. Because basically they said, we like what you're doing, Guilford, and we want you to keep researching. So they sent him to Southern California. He moved to the University of Southern California, and down there, it was the home of Guilford's research from 1945 to 1965. It was called the Aptitudes Project. At the University of Southern California, Guilford refined his theory. He eventually called it the Structure of Intellect. It's usually represented by this cube, and it has a lot of columns and rows on each side. We're going to talk about this in a later video and what these things mean. Guilford argued that there are 150 separate intellectual abilities, or different factors. Because as you can see here, we have 5, and then down is 6, and then over is another 5. So basically, he believed that there were 150 separate intellectual abilities. We'll talk about that later. But just for now, remember that the cube represents all of those different combinations of intelligence and intellectual abilities. Now, J.P. Guilford had a following of people. Lots of PhD students wanted to come and learn from him, and he actually had a following of those PhD students. This included a husband-wife duo, Robert and Mary Meeker, reducing the dropout rate. Basically, pilots applied to the U.S. Army Air Corps, and their applications were being rejected because things were more strict and they were looking for the right kinds of people. Now, this is great for the employer or for the association that's in charge, but it isn't great for the student or for the person who is applying and wants the job. What about somebody who wants to become a pilot or wants to do a certain job and they're being rejected because they don't have the intellectual abilities yet that make it easy for them to do it? Mary Meeker's mentality was different. She believed if you don't have the intellectual abilities, let's develop them so that you become right for the job. Now, this is obviously a really different kind of approach, because what Mary Meeker believed was that a person's intellectual ability could rise over time. It could actually get better, stronger, and more developed as time passed. So maybe a person begins down in the low range where they're rejected from a job or possibly failing a test because certain types of intellectual abilities are so difficult for them. However, if they improve those things and get better at them, then they move into the higher green zone where they're accepted for a job or they're passing a test. This is a really exciting possibility that has lots of implications.
SOI is an extremely powerful and well-researched tool developed over 75 years, initially by Dr. J.P. Guilford and subsequently by Dr. Meeker. Ambereen Pradhan extensively trained over a period of 7 years with Dr. Meeker to take the application, the research, and the development of SOI forward. She and her organization have been issued a very special authority certificate by Dr. Meeker. She is a trained cognitive psychologist and founded Energia SOI, a futuristic organization that is taking SOI's legacy forward. Today, Energia SOI is committed to the cause of education upliftment using SOI and has an extensive global network presence in 45 countries across Australia, Asia, the Middle East, Africa, Europe, and US. Energia is growing each day into newer markets and thereby providing J.P. Guilford and Dr. Meeker their primary goal to benefit education and eradicate learning poverty.
Today, the SOI test is used in countries around the world. Who can use SOI? Basically, everybody who's old enough to think and communicate. So that includes children who are in elementary, middle school, high school, university-age students who are going to college or doing master's programs, adults, professionals, and PhD applicants. Basically, anybody who wants increased brain performance. And that's really important if you're studying or learning something, or even if you're working in your job, having high levels of brain performance is a really important thing. So the structure of intellect and that cube that we looked at before is a good way to remember that there are a lot of specific intellectual abilities. J.P. Guilford argued that there were 150. Mary Meeker later reduced that to about 90, but still, it's important to recognize how many different types of brain functions there are, because sometimes when we take tests and when we try to learn things, it gets oversimplified, and that gets confusing. So if you're interested in increased brain performance, then continuing with SOI is really a unique way to identify the specific problems that you're having so that you know what they are, identify them, and then have a way to overcome them.